Dear students, I welcome you in this lecture on the topic shares and dividends. In the previous lecture, we had seen some basic terminology related to shares. Now, in this lecture, we will study equity shares, preference shares, bonus shares, and deferred shares. So first, let us see what are equity shares. In equity shares, the rate of dividend is fluctuating and it depends on performance of a company. Next, they rank next to the preference shares in receiving of dividend. In other words, they have second preference as compared to preference shareholders for receiving of dividend. The third property, equity shareholders have voting right in general meeting of a company. So they have voting right. The fourth point is equity shares are always irredeemable except for buyback provision. So equity shares are always irredeemable. Next point is the rank they rank next to preference shares in return of capital. They rank next to preference shares in the return of capital. Finally, equity shareholders can participate in the management of the company affairs. So they can participate in management affairs of the company. So they can interact and actively participate in making policy decisions. Now let us study preference shares. For preference shares, the rate of dividend is fixed and it is fixed at the time of issuing shares. So note the difference between equity shares and preference shares. So for preference shares, rate of dividend is fixed and it is fixed at the time of issuing shares. Whereas the rate of dividend is fluctuating, that is varying, and it depends on performance of company. So the main difference between equity shares and preference shares is this. For equity shares, rate of dividend is fluctuating and for preference shares, rate of dividend is fixed. We can have a comparison here. The point A corresponds to the point A here, this comparison. Then next comparison is they get first preference for receiving dividend. So compare this with point of equity shares. They have second preference as compared to preference shareholders. So preference shareholders get first preference for receiving dividend. This is a point of comparison. Third point is that the equity shareholders do not have any voting right. They do not have voting right. Whereas equity shareholders have voting right. So compare this point with this. Equity shareholders have voting right. Preference shareholders do not have voting right. Preference shares are redeemed at the end of period for which they are issued. Again, you can compare this point with this point. So, equity shares are irredeemable, whereas preference shares are redeemed at the end of period for which they are issued. Finally, preference shareholders do not participate in the management of company affairs, whereas equity shareholders can participate in the management of company affairs. Again, you can compare these 2 points. So I have given you the similar points for equity shares and preference shareholders. So if you remember the points for equity shares, you can write down corresponding points for preference shares. Next, we'll see what are bonus shares. If company gets more profit, then some free shares are given to its shareholders in proportion to number of shares held by them. These shares are called bonus shares. They are equivalent in all respects to other shares except for the fact that they are issued free of cost. They are issued in proportion to number of shares that shareholders hold. As an example, suppose company decides to give 10 shares, 10 bonus shares, 10 bonus shares. So I'll write it here. Suppose company decides to give 10 bonus shares per 1000 shares. So if shareholder has say 100 shares, then he will get one bonus share. Then the shareholder will get one bonus share. If another shareholder has say 10,000 shares of company, then he will get 10 bonus shares. So they are issued in proportion to number of shares held by existing, then he will get 100 bonus shares. For 10,000 he will get 100 bonus shares. So bonus shares are issued in proportion to number of shares held by existing shareholders. Finally, deferred shares are held by the founders of the company. These shareholders don't get dividend until it is distributed to all other classes of its shareholders. They are also called as founder shares or management shares. So these are shares which are held by founders of the company. Thank you.